And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. I'm not going to read the bio that is in each of your folders. I trust that all of you can read that. What I would like to tell you is that Jayne has over 25 years of experience in the industry. Her experience and credentials are long and impressive, and you can read all about her, but let me tell you what I've learned about Jayne. Our conversation started about a year ago when our board was first trying to identify a keynote speaker. And Jayne had spoken at some of our conferences in the past and had been well received, so she was definitely on the short list. When I first contacted her, she and her husband had recently arrived in Kyrgyzstan did I say that right? To work with this country's orphanage system. They had already been there 3 weeks and were still trying to locate their luggage. Rather than cry or curse, which is pretty much how I would handle that, she took it in stride, and later, having never retrieved their luggage in the 6-month stay that they had, she said last night, we learned how little we could live on. And that is just a little insight into Jayne's character, to just be very philosophical and introspective about that. It just said a lot to me. We spoke overseas despite her busy work, and it was just like a warm hug over the telephone wires. And we just knew we wanted to have her here. She's a biological parent, as well as a foster and adoptive parent. She's a grandmother, and last night she became my Facebook friend. She can relate to each of you in some way, and I hope you'll enjoy getting to know her today as much as I have over the past year. Please give a warm welcome to Jayne Schooler.
What a gracious introduction, and thank you. It's an incredible privilege to be here. I always am humbled when I'm with folks like you. And the interesting thing about foster and adoptive parents, those of you that are brand new, you may have not discovered this yet, but those of you who have been in the journey a while, we don't need to finish sentences. We know what we're saying to each other. Would you say that's probably the case? Yeah, I know. There's a lot of people that may not understand at all. I'm just going to share just real briefly how we landed here in this world of foster care and adoption. And then, by the way, your phone is up here. If you're looking for your phone. In 1978, my husband and I were living in Branson, Missouri. He's a pastor. And there was a family in that church that was that they were foster parents to 5 teenage boys. I can't imagine that. And the mother was in a car accident. And so on a Saturday evening, they told the boys that they were all going to have to be moved. And that Sunday morning, Jeff, who was 14 at the time, stopped by my husband at the door and asked him if we would become his foster parents. Now, that was not on our to-do list. We had only been married 3 years. We had a daughter that was just a little over a year. And it's interesting, when you're asked a question, how you answer that question may change the course of your life. And so, after consideration about Jeff, we said, yes, we would do this. We did not even know what we didn't know. How many of you discover that every day? I didn't know that. We could be a lifelong learner. Well, Jeff moved in, and I don't remember a home study being done. It must have been not too traumatic. I don't have it seared in my memory as being trauma. But also, I did learn later that only meeting his caseworker 3 times face-to-face in the 3.5 years he lived with us in Missouri was not exactly good social work. And so I didn't know it was to be any different. We were then transferred to a congregation in Ohio, and Jeff came with us, and we were literally not unpacked when we got a call from the local Children's Services Department saying, we heard there's a new family in town that takes teens, would you take Ray? And those of you that are families have had those phone calls. Those of you that are workers have made those phone calls, so I know what that's about. And we said yes to Ray, who was 14. So at the age of 29, I thought I was parenting then 17-year-old Jeff, who came with us, and Ray, who was 14. In 1983, at the dinner table one evening, Ray asked us if we would adopt him. And we did. He was then 16. I'm such an advocate of teen adoption because you're not only adopting a teenager, you're adopting someone who's now 42 and has made me a grandmother. And so it's that kind of lifelong thing. People ask me how many children I have. Well, I said I have 2. I have a son, 42, and a daughter 32, and I know they're counting behind their back how old was I when I met. Because you know, on the birth certificate, I was 14 living in Ohio, and my husband was 25 living in Oklahoma. And I explained that to your Army recruiting officer. He said, "What is it with your parents here?" But Ray's journey with us has taught us so much about this whole journey. I left the field of education to become a worker, adoption coordinator at a public agency, and left that field in 1996 to be a full-time trainer. My job in Ohio full-time is training adoption and social workers, hopefully to do a better job. So I hope that they are. But along the journey, I have found something that is so critically important. I'm going to talk to you this morning about the heart of your children and the heart need of your children. And I call the message The Incredible Power of Validation. And I think we all know what that word validation means. Support, confirmation, verification. It's a word that has very powerful meaning. It comes from the emotional experience of when we ourselves have been validated. Someone has said something to you about a job well done, or a vision or dream you have. They are encouraging you, and you're excited about that. Or the validation comes from the very special place we might have in our families. And validation is an empowering experience. Hopefully, all of you have had that experience of being validated about something you wanted to do. Sadly, we often experience invalidation. And I think many of us have experienced that. And that's a word that also comes with incredible meaning. It comes from the emotional experience of being invalidated. It means we don't count. We have been annulled. We have been canceled out. We have been, in the strongest sense of the word, abandoned as to who we are. And invalidation is disempowering. You know, in your adoption journey, and I hope as I see you today that you might share with me, but in your adoption journey, your dream to become adopted parents, you may have been invalidated. People, this world is full of commenters. Do you know what commenters are? Commenters are those people who tell you something, give you advice that you have not asked for, but they feel that you are incompetent and they need to give you the advice. How many of you have ever, even this week, have you had a commenter? You know what I'm talking about. My husband says, don't tell anybody what you paid for the car, because they say you could get that car down the street, you know, $5 cheaper. So we all are broadsided by commenters, people that say things to us as adoptive parents or as foster parents. And I bet I could have you shout out some things that you have experienced in validation in your adoption journey. Anybody want to shout out anything? Like, you shook your head. If you don't shake your head because you get called on. Like, are those your real kids? Or can't you just send them back after all? They're only adopted? Why would you want to parent anybody else's problem? Have you had those things said to you? I don't know that I can really love them. They're not really a blood relative. I had one family that shared an incredible story with me, and they were adopting from China. And she had two little daughters. She had adopted from China. And she was at her father's 75th birthday celebration. And everybody from the family had come, and they were sitting around kind of like you all are. And he said, I want to thank my children for coming, and I want to thank my grandchildren for coming, and I want to thank my adopted grandchildren for coming. And she sat there, why in the world did he make that distinction? And so she went to him later, and he said, I just need to be precise. They are adopted, you know. And the message that she received of invalidation was devastating to her. And as adoptive parents, you may experience that same message. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as we go through the message. But I want you to know that our children who enter our homes through adoption potentially may have stuffed into their back pockets the belief of being invalidation, of being abandoned. I don't really count. I don't really belong here. I'm not all that important. Maybe I just should be invisible. And so I'm going to talk to you this morning just about 4 things that we can do to speak to the heart of our children so that they will grow up with a sense of being validated, that where they are is where they're supposed to be, and enjoy the journey with us. There's 4 things that we're going to look at this morning. Validation, number 1, comes from acceptance. You say, oh, that's easy. I can accept my child for who he is. Everybody can love a child, can't you? And that's true. But let me ask you a question. In that acceptance, have you acknowledged the things the child has brought with him? And those are things that may cost you something to validate. I'm going to share 2 of those things. So we're talking about validation comes from acceptance. The first thing that you might need to deal with is perhaps a traumatic past that has changed your beautiful child at the core of who he would have been. That you have believed and validated in your hearts the awful truths of what abuse and neglect has done to that beautiful child. And that by believing, you have experienced his pain from his point of view. And one of the things about acceptance is dealing with the reality of what our child, not what is wrong with our child maybe, but what has happened to our child to create what we're living with. And so the part of acceptance is coming to believe and validate that part. Another part of acceptance, and we had talked about this night at the dinner table, I don't know if this is harder for adoptive moms than it is for adoptive dads, but is to face the challenge of what I call the impact of the psychological presence. And you're saying, oh, we're getting a little clinical here, and it's too early on Saturday morning. But what we're talking about here, there was a study done a number of years ago of families that had men missing in action in Vietnam. And although the men were physically absent from the family, they were still psychologically present in the family, so much so that it impacted the family's beliefs, emotions, their communication, and everything. Well, a good friend of mine at Ohio State was doing her doctoral research on adoption. And she said, whoa, isn't the psychological piece part of adoption? Who is going to be psychologically present in the adoptive family? Birth parents, absolutely. Invited or uninvited, they're going to be there. And primarily the birth mother. And this is kind of played out in the research. And I think this is one of the greatest challenges for particularly adoptive moms. Because if you allow that psychological presence of the birth mother in the household, it may threaten who you are in the eyes of your child. It may threaten your role in your child's life. And there's 2 ways that you can deal with that psychological presence. And Sheila, I'm going to use you, okay? You can be living in the land of denial, okay? Your son's first name is, I'm sorry, Alex. Okay, Alex, this is his 8th birthday. I know he's not 8 yet, but this is his 8th birthday, and he comes running up to you and says, Mom, do you think my birth mother thinks about me on my birthday? And because you live in denial, you are not embracing this part of acceptance of who your child is. You say, well, honey, I'm your mother now, and that's all that matters. What's the message Alex got you? No, not really important here. You just invalidated a need of his. A friend of mine said, and I believe this is true, I've not tested it, but I believe that an adopted child will only ask the questions that they feel they have the permission to ask. I'm not sure if that's completely true. I've not run it in the research, but Carrie, you're kind of shaking your head. I think so. That an adopted child will ask only the questions they feel they have the permission to ask. So what has Alex been denied? Permission, right from that statement. Rewind the tape. You're a different mom. At Alex's 8th birthday, he comes running up to you and said, Mom, do you think my birth mother thinks about me on my birthday? Because you've embraced that as part of the acceptance of who your child is and what he brought in, you say to Alex, honey, I don't know, because you cannot answer for birth parents. But you would say, yes, I would think so. And what's also important is I think about your birth mother on your birthday, and I bet you do too. Do you want to do something about it? Do you want to draw a picture and put it in your birth parent box? Do you want to do something? You want to send a letter to the agency? You acknowledge that. And in that acknowledgement, you're sending an incredible sense of acceptance and validation for what this child has brought into the house. I don't say that it's not easy, is it? We don't want to have to share the heart of our kids, but the reality is, the more you share the heart of your kids, the more you're going to get back with that issue. The second part of validation comes from belonging, that your child picks up the message that you belong here. What is interesting, I read an article, it's probably, my goodness, it might have been 10 years ago even, but I've not forgotten the power of this article. And this is something you can share with your extended family members. They interviewed adults who had been adopted as older children. And they asked them, who gave you the greatest sense of belonging in your family? Anybody want to guess? Grandparents. Isn't that amazing? They said, we knew our parents had to make us feel belong, but it's when my grandparents, one young man said, when my grandfather invited me to go out fishing all by myself without all the other cousins, I knew that I truly belonged like everybody else. So your extended family members are really key in incorporating that sense of belonging. Because you know what? Some of your children get up every morning and look at you and say, I don't look like you. Do I really belong here? Now that may not be on their conscious level. So our job as adoptive parents is such an exciting thing in terms of building this sense of belonging, to validate their relationship in the family. And it comes from a fundamental principle that begins with teaching that child that he or she was meant to be in this family, that I believe God makes families through adoption as well as procreation, and that there is a reason for everything, including joining your permanent family through adoption instead of by birth. And so we don't know how the mysteries of all of this, but I believe our children are growing up in homes where they're supposed to be. Another thing that is significant about building belonging is names. Naming your children. And it's we don't have time this morning to go into my little soapbox about not changing children's names that come in as older. We won't go there. But adding a child's name from that's a significant family name helps to build belongings as well. And it's attaching a middle name of a family member does that as well. And belonging comes through the recipient of legitimate praise. Now, we could overpraise our kids, but some of that belonging comes from warm hugs and physical closeness. You know, merely the power of your presence in your child's life, your availability to your child. It's that time. How many of you have read the same book to your children more than 5 times? Right? And if you make a mistake or leave something out, they know it, right? But you know what? You're doing a magnificent thing of building belonging into that child. Small gestures, like as in such a note in a lunchbox or preparation of a special dinner. We'll saying, you're very special to us. You belong here just like everybody else. And belonging also comes from active listening. I had to laugh when Sheila told me her story about getting all ready for this conference and neglecting your children. A number of years ago, I was working on a training curriculum on healthy adoptive families. And my daughter, who was probably maybe 7 at the time, came into my room where I was working, and she said, Mom, would you come and play the piano with me? I said, honey, I can't. I'm working on this healthy family teaching. So I said, I think maybe I better shut down the computer and go play the piano. Isn't that kind of like what you felt? But just the total active listening. Most of us are better lecturers than we are listeners. Would you say that's probably true with our kids? But we need to learn how to listen. So we've talked about validation comes from accepting what our children bring in, and that means even welcoming the presence of the birth family. And that's going to cost you something. It's going to cost a little bit of your heart to do that. Second thing that builds validation is belonging, that our children receive the message, and that our extended family members can help us in building that powerful sense of belonging. The third thing, which I think is incredibly powerful, comes from giving a child a sense of dignity. I tell the story, a number of years ago, this happened. I have a friend by the name of Liz McAllister, and she is an adopted mom and also an adoption social worker in Clinton County, Ohio. And she adopted 2 beautiful kids from Korea. And Patrick was 7 when this happened, and Megan was 4. And they were sitting in a restaurant, and a woman came up to them at the restaurant and looked at Liz and said, "Oh, what beautiful children you have." How many of you had that comment? I'm sure people say they stop you, they look at your kids. And looked at Liz, "Oh, what beautiful children." Then she looked at Peter, who was 7, and asked him this question: "Why did your mother get rid of you?" I know. But you know what? Peter goes like this to his mom, because she had prepared him to answer those commenters and those things people say. She empowered him by validating him. And so he simply looked at her and said, "We only talk about that at home." And passed his first test. And he felt no obligation. So dignity comes from in helping our kids respond to those kind of things. I'm going to share a tool with you in just a minute here about that. But dignity comes with building a strong moral and ethical and spiritual environment for our kids, that our kids have solid principles on which to make decisions, and learning right and wrong, and setting loving boundaries. Our kids desperately want boundaries. They may act like they don't, but they do. And another part of dignity is giving them tools, as I just mentioned here with Peter, the ability to respond to those people who say things that are not appropriate. How many of you have heard of a little thing called Wise Up? Few of you have heard of Wise Up. The rest of you haven't. So just if I had a flip chart here, I would have Wise Up written down like this. What they call acronyms, I think is what they call them. Okay, Wise Up. This is a tool that you can use yourself, and when your kids get a little older, you can use it. You can train and teach them. Remember, you are empowering them. You are validating them. You're giving them a sense of dignity. They don't have to be victims of people saying things to them. Wise Up stands for the W stands for they can simply walk away. So you have your child is playing at the playground at school. A kid walks up to him and says, "How come you don't look a thing like your parents?" Okay? Johnny can just simply, because he's practiced at home, and you can think of all the things people might say to him, he simply turns around and walks away. You've empowered him with something. The second thing, Wise Up, is it stands for it's private. It's private. So, kid runs up to Johnny, "How come you don't look a thing like your parents?" And Johnny simply responds, "It's private." That's it. That's the end of the story. You've empowered him. The third thing is that the child can simply say when they comment, "How come you don't look a thing like your mom?" Share. That's what S means, share. And they can simply say, "I'm adopted, duh." Who said that last night? Kathy said that. Where's Kathy? Isn't that what your daughter said? Duh, I'm adopted, like make them feel. But yeah, say I was adopted from India, or I was adopted from Chicago. I was born in Chicago. And the fourth one stands for educate. Now, I'm not sure that I would ask a child to do any education about adoption and foster care, but this is something you might use. You're standing in the grocery store and you have all your kids with you, and someone says to you, "Are those foster kids? They don't look a thing like you." You don't have to answer a personal question. You can simply say, "There are 550,000 children in foster care in this country, and I have in my purse a little card. I'll give you a number to call." What more can they say? You just educate them. And so if we're going to build dignity in our kids, we have to empower them. If we're going to build validation, we have to empower them. And I'm going to share a really funny story I shared last night at dinner. They said, "Make sure you tell that story tomorrow." And I think another aspect, so Wise Up is walk away, it's private, share, educate. Well, there's another component. It's called a little bit of humor. And I think I can tell both these stories in 30 seconds, both of them. This is from the parent's perspective, and the other one, the story is from a child's perspective. I have a good friend who's an adoption therapist in Cincinnati. She has 4 transracially adopted children, and they're all quite a bit darker than she is. And she was in a grocery store, and she was checking her things out on the counter and just putting things on the counter. And the woman said to her, "Are those all your kids?" And Debbie didn't stop I'm feeling partial. She said, yes. And she looked at them again and said, they're pretty dark. And she was emptying the cart, and then she said, I guess their father was pretty dark. Not missing a lick. Debbie said, I don't know, I never saw him. What can you say? I mean, okay. This one, I think, would win a Reader's Digest award. And now you can write this one down for your children, because your children may be getting the question, where did you get those blue eyes? Or why do you have all those freckles? And nobody in your family has freckles. Or I was at a banquet, and the probate judge was talking about the adoption of a little 4-year-old. Now, I don't want to offend anybody in this room, okay? But he described this little girl as walking in the court. She was 4, kind of chunky, said, walking in the courtroom in front of her parents like she owned the place. You could tell she was a take-charge kid. Now, please don't be offended, but what color of hair did she have? Red. Please don't be offended on your redheads. Yeah, it's okay. So I see the redhead shaking head. And he said it was the most beautiful hair he had ever seen. It was long and really curly. He said, so I called her up to the bench before we started the proceedings, and he said, honey, I just need to talk to you about something. I've never seen such beautiful hair. Where did you get that red hair? And he said, this little chunky 4-year-old put her hands on her hips, then stuck his little finger out like this to the judge in his dark robes. Says, Judge, it came with my head. I love it. I absolutely love it. When we think about that, write that down so your child can next time respond, it came with my head. I said, how would you like to have her at 16? So we're talking about building validation in the heart and minds of our children, and a part of that is building dignity. And obviously to learn to honor the child's heritage, and you have a lot of work about that, but also to support the child's efforts to achieve. And don't humiliate a failure, but work with the child to be successful as he can in other areas that he is able to do. Your child may not fit the dream you have for him or her. We can't make our kids into be what we weren't. But part of the validating our kids and providing dignity is to support their efforts to achieve. Being shorter than his competitors, Josh's dad knew that making a basketball team would be very, very difficult for Josh. When he failed to make the team, his father was prepared. He picked him up from practice, took him out for dinner, and validated his courageous efforts to make it. Then they talked about the upcoming baseball season, which Josh was really good about that, and they made plans to get baseball shoes the next week. So instead of being devastated by when our children don't match up to what we expect, that we validate them for who they are. And the last one comes from a sense of destiny, picturing a special future for our kids. And that takes time to see what our kids have. I have just about 2 or 3 minutes here left, but I want to share a real quick story. This happened in the year 2000. Many of you are too young to remember the Vietnam airlift. I remember when that happened. The Vietnam rushing babies out of Vietnam at the last minute. Well, fast forward 25 years later, they were Vietnamese boat-lift children were now adults met in Baltimore, and they found something rather unique about these kids who are now young adults, that they did not seem to have all the adoption issues. A lot of them that the other adopted kids have had, like loss, rejection, shame, guilt, all that stuff you hear all the time. And they said, why is that not the case? And they began hearing it from different parts of the room, but it was boiled down to 2 things, and it had to do with their belief system. Someone had validated their beliefs as they were growing up and pictured a special future for them. And the 2 beliefs were that they understood that their parents made the greatest sacrifice on earth when they released them to go on the airplane so their lives would be saved. They knew they were not rejected. They were released to live, and they understood that. Someone along the line had validated those concerns. The second thing, as a whole, the group seemed to say, was that they believed their lives were saved for a purpose. And when you can communicate the special nature of the lives, the beautiful lives in your children, validate that, it gives them such a sense of destiny in their lives. And they may have come from very difficult circumstances, but they're in your family now, and they're in your family for a reason. And that's so very important. So as we kind of end here this morning, that as we validate our kids, there's 4 things that we can do. And the validation comes from a sense of acceptance, what they bring into the home. It comes from building a sense of belonging, that I really belong here. This is where I'm supposed to be. Giving them a sense of dignity, and that's empowering them to respond to commenters and building that sense of destiny. And I just want to honor you this morning. You're just an incredible group of people. I hope I get to meet you today. And if you come up to me, make sure you have pictures ready when you come. So thank you very much.